The Fairbrother Lecture is a University of Reading public lecture named after Jack Fairbrother, who in 1929 became the first student to be awarded a PhD from the university. My name is Toms Voits, and it is my privilege to deliver this year's lecture. Bilingualism is a complex phenomenon that is frequently featured in the media headlines. We hear questions such as, who may be considered to be a true bilingual? Does it count if you only acquire another language later in life? Or do you have to learn two languages from birth to be considered bilingual? Why do some people find it easier to pick up another language while others struggle? Does that mean that some people have brains that are more predisposed to language learning? Some worry that children will be confused if they are presented with more than one language growing up, while others encourage exposure to multiple languages from an early age, believing that this exposure ultimately leads to social or cognitive benefits as the child grows up. Now, there are headlines telling us that bilinguals are smarter than their monolingual counterparts, that bilinguals are more creative, or even better lovers. And our interest is understandable. Alongside all of this very public interest, experience of language and bilingualism is a personal and highly intimate experience. The language we speak is, after all, one of the defining factors of our identity. What I want to talk to you about today are some questions asked in the scientific community. There are many obvious advantages of speaking more than one language, like increased understanding of other cultures or helping our career prospects. But beyond those, are there other effects of speaking an additional language, including any effects on our cognition? And by cognition, scientists mean mental processes such as attention, memory, reasoning, problem solving, and decision making. So, if a bilingual is a person who knows more than one language, then how can language be defined? In short, language is a structured system of communication that allows us to communicate via speech, written symbols, or through gesture, as is the case for sign languages. Now, this system can be thought of in layers, and these layers include, for instance, meaning or semantics, the sound system of language, which is phonology, the structure of words themselves, or morphology, the structure of sentences or phrases, which is syntax, and how context contributes to meaning, which is pragmatics. Some argue that our capacity for language is what actually makes us human. Only humans have the ability to create and understand completely novel utterances. We can generate an unlimited number of them, ones that we have never heard and ones that may have never been spoken before by any other human being. A famous example of this capacity comes from Noam Chomsky, often referred to as the father of modern linguistics. We're glad and honored to have him visit Reading as an Albert Walters Distinguished Professor in 2017, just as I was starting my PhD. Here, he is with me and other members of our research group during his visit. Chomsky's example of generating a sentence that could work grammatically but had probably never been uttered before by another human was, "Colorless green ideas sleep furiously." While a sentence like this was completely novel and I'm sure had never been spoken before, it is a perfectly grammatical and acceptable sentence in English. And although it is nonsensical, we can still understand it. It is truly wonderful, and no other species have this ability to communicate. Now, if speaking just one language is so complex, then how is it then that humans are able to acquire another language, or in some cases, many languages? Well, let's take a moment to contemplate. What is your definition of a bilingual? And I often ask people this question, and the answers tend to vary enormously. At the one end of the spectrum, some feel that as soon as you know how to ask for basic directions and how to produce simple phrases and sentences in a second language, you are already at least a little bilingual. At the other end of the spectrum, many only consider someone who has been brought up with multiple languages as a true bilingual. And my own definition falls somewhere between these two ends of the spectrum. I would say that one is bilingual if they have sufficient knowledge of two languages to be able to hold a conversation in either of their languages. So one thing that is really important to acknowledge while we're at it is that no two bilinguals are exactly the same. Now, underpinning this single word, which is bilingual, there is a huge variability. And this includes the ages at which the languages were acquired, the patterns of using our languages, what we use our languages for, whether we acquire our second language in a classroom setting or more naturalistically, how similar our two languages are or how different they are to each other. And, well, I could go on. But the key issue here is to bear in mind that these differences may well interplay with the effects of bilingualism on cognition. Now, this is what makes bilingualism such a complex and interesting phenomenon to study. It is an individual experience that is quite difficult to quantify. There is no doubt, accordingly, that bilinguals come in various shapes and sizes, so to speak. Some acquire two languages from birth, others become bilingual only later in life. Some individuals speak one language that we might call a heritage language in their family setting, and this is different from the language spoken by the wider society. There are many heritage bilinguals around the world. In the UK alone, 1 in 5 primary education pupils speak a heritage language other than English at home. And some of the most common heritage languages in the UK include Urdu, Polish, Bengali, Punjabi, and Portuguese. And this is mirrored by data from the United States, where 21% of children speak a language that is not English at home. Now think about it. This is a significant proportion of children that are growing up bilingual. The last thing to stress about bilingualism, where we're looking at definitions, is that bilingualism is actually the norm worldwide. It may come as a surprise, but more than half of the world's population is able to communicate in at least two languages. There are over 2,000 living languages in the continent of Africa alone. Australia is thought to hold approximately 250 indigenous languages before the languages of migration are even counted. In 2006, 38% of the UK reported to be bilingual, and in the EU in 2016, about 3/4 of the population were reported to be able to speak at least one foreign language. In Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Sweden, and Denmark, more than 95% of the population report speaking at least one additional language. So you see that bilingualism is prevalent, even in the context of Western world. Now, let's look at the neuroscience behind this. Remember, we talked about before that language contains many different layers. Now, what does the brain have to do to accommodate for the presence of two whole linguistic systems? And well, turns out it's all about competition. Many research studies have shown that when an individual has two languages, both of these languages remain constantly active in their brain. We can call this dual activation. And this dual activation of both languages is necessary so that the speaker can easily and instantly switch from one language into the other. Now you can think of this like a car engine idling constantly in the background on a frosty winter's morning. If your car engine had lain dormant for a while, it might take you a few moments to start it up again. If, on the other hand, your engine has been quietly firing away the whole time in the background, it is warm, it is ready to go at a moment's notice. And in the same way, the brain appears to keep all languages activated all the time. And this explains the apparent ease with which bilinguals are able to switch between their languages, even within the same conversation. So dual activation is important, but this also means that both languages are at a constant tug-of-war state. They're both competing for the spotlight. The many layers of the two languages, meaning, sound, structure, all of this is active and competing at all times. So now we have a situation where both languages need to be kept active, and therefore they compete with one another. And this requires some serious mental juggling from the bilingual individual. This competition then has to be controlled so that the language being produced is appropriate for a given context. Without cognitive control, we might produce a language that the other person does not understand, or even a mix of all languages available to us. Now, let me give you an example. If we have two language systems, for example, English and Spanish available to me, this object is either apple or manzana. Both of these representations are active. Both of these engines are revving, they're competing with one another, they're pulling in opposite directions. My brain then has to decide that if I'm having a conversation in a context where English is used, then apple and not manzana is the right choice for me to make. My mental representations of Spanish have to be suppressed or inhibited, while my use of English needs to be constantly monitored so that no elements from the competing language system intrude while I'm speaking English. Now this need, the need to control two languages that are at constant competition, brings us right back to the heart of our question about the impact of bilingualism on cognition. It turns out that the mechanisms we use for bilingual language control are actually part of a set of wider cognitive control mechanisms which we call executive functions. These are a set of functions that are responsible for overall cognitive control, and they include attention shifting, inhibition or suppression of irrelevant stimuli to maintain focus, and monitoring of one's behavior. We use executive functions when we shift our attention from one task to another, or when we ignore noises that are stopping us from concentrating on something else. We use these skills every day to learn, work, and manage daily life, to focus, and to even manage our emotions. Albert Costa, a Spanish neuroscientist who was instrumental to the research field of bilingualism and the brain, gave a very good comparison of the same mental processes being involved when driving a car. To successfully pilot a vehicle, one needs to monitor the road and speed limits. One needs to be able to rapidly shift our attention in case of a sudden obstacle on the road. While driving, one also sometimes needs to inhibit some stimuli. If you have driven with loud children on the back seat or with notifications chiming out of your phone, you will know that these can really try and pry our attention away from the road unless we really focus on the task at hand. And this really is the very essence of the proposed general effects of bilingualism on cognition. So, inside a bilingual mind, the two languages are kept active, and because they're both active, they compete with one another. And because a bilingual then has to contend with this competition, it makes a heavy use of control mechanisms and this executive functioning. And if this increased use of executive function means that executive functioning grows stronger, then these effects will be felt beyond the language system. Now, just an example, consider this. If one works out in a gym on a regular basis and becomes fitter as a result, they will not only be fit when inside the gym, there are more general health effects of that. In the same way, it is reasonable to expect that increased load on the executive control system because of this exercise of managing two languages, this may extend to fine-tuning of cognitive control in a more general sense. Great. Now, how can we empirically test this idea that bilinguals may have improved executive functioning? Thankfully, psychologists have a wide arsenal of tasks designed specifically to tap into the cognitive processes underlying executive function. One example of these is the Stroop task, which is routinely used in psycholinguistics research. It is a basic task for looking at the ability to inhibit or ignore irrelevant stimuli and to monitor conflict. Now let's see how this works. Now you'll see words appearing on your screen, and your task is to ignore the meaning of the word together, of the word absolutely together, and just state the color in which the word is written. Now let's try this. Now, if you found that you had to work harder to say the color of the ink instead of what was written, then what you just experienced is called the Stroop effect. That is, you noticed a delay in your reaction time when the stimuli pulled you in different directions, and one of these had to be resisted. Once there is this competition or conflict introduced, it becomes just that little bit more difficult to produce the correct response. Well, this task, amongst many others, has been widely used to compare reaction times between monolingual and bilingual groups. Now, while all of us, monolinguals, bilinguals, all of us display Stroop effects, what some studies show is that bilingual populations show a significantly smaller Stroop effect when compared to monolinguals, and this suggests a more fine-tuned cognitive control ability. Well, this has then come to be called the bilingual advantage, and well, this so-called bilingual advantage has also been a source of contention in the field. Now, some research groups have not been able to replicate or reproduce the effects I just talked about, and therefore they have claimed that none of these effects really exist, or that if they do, then they are limited and only manifest under certain conditions. And I will not go further in discussing this controversy, but I would argue that it may be the incredible variability amongst bilingual profiles that holds the key to better understanding the exact effects of bilingualism on cognition as a whole. One thing that you will see in many studies of bilingual cognition is that they make use of mainly younger individuals as study participants. And this makes practical sense. Research is commonly carried out on university campuses, and college students are the most available for participation in research. And while behavioral data from these younger participants does show mixed results, the results from studies with older individuals does not only tend to be more consistent, but they also suggest some very real health benefits associated with bilingualism to people in the later years of life. Most notably, studies have suggested that the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease and the onset of symptoms is on average 4 to 5 years later in bilingual individuals than in monolinguals. Now, this finding has led to further investigation, and in healthy aging bilinguals, it is often found that brain areas underlying executive control and language processing are greater in volume and have improved structural integrity. Thus, it can be said that bilingualism contributes to the building up of extra brain matter over the years, leading to a kind of brain reserve. In theory, this building up of brain matter may lead to delayed or slower deterioration from either aging or disease, and intuitively, it makes sense. If there is more of something, then more time will be required to break it down. Another mechanism that bilingualism seems to contribute to is something termed cognitive reserve. Cognitive reserve is a theoretical concept that accounts for the brain's ability to compensate for neural tissue loss. In other words, this relates to how well an individual copes with loss of neural tissue. And this may come as a surprise, but there is no direct mapping from brain structure to behavior. That is, a decline in neural matter will not always correlate with changes in cognitive performance. So, if we measure an older person's cognitive performance and compare those results with their structural brain health, it can be possible that they show impairment or atrophy of neural tissue, but not show any corresponding impairment to cognitive ability. That is, it is possible that even in the presence of brain pathology, someone who has built a high cognitive reserve might perform cognitively like someone with much healthier brain tissue. And the way we know that bilingualism contributes to cognitive reserve comes directly from studies investigating clinical populations, those with a diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment or dementia. In some studies, older monolinguals and older bilinguals with a clinical diagnosis are matched for their cognitive performance, and then both groups are tested for brain health. And the bilingual individuals who perform just as well as monolinguals in cognitive terms, they actually show more atrophy in their brain tissue, meaning that their brains had structurally declined to a greater extent. And this may seem counterintuitive at first, like why are bilingual brains in a worse state? But keep in mind that these are individuals with a clinical diagnosis of progressive neurodegeneration, and they are actually performing better than would be expected. They can do more with less. So in other words, in a bilingual brain that has undergone physical deterioration related to disease, we might see this mechanism of a neural compensation. Looking at things in a different way, a recent study turned this question upside down and matched bilinguals and monolinguals not by cognitive health as had been done before, but by brain health, and then compared their cognitive performance. And they found that all the bilinguals were cognitively healthy, and some monolinguals with the same level of brain health had already developed symptoms of mild cognitive impairment, and some even Alzheimer's disease. So this buildup of cognitive reserve is likely to be the reason why bilinguals are diagnosed for dementia later in life than monolinguals. They compensate for underlying neurodegeneration for longer, and therefore present for memory clinics when symptoms appear and when this underlying neural tissue has undergone much more atrophy than would be the case for individuals with low cognitive reserve. So what this suggests is that bilingualism might help build up a brain reserve during healthy aging, but as neurodegenerative processes begin, it may provide this additional compensatory ability in the form of a cognitive reserve. And this means that symptoms become apparent later in life, thus providing this very real, tangible health benefit in aging. It is important to say that bilingualism is not unique in this sense, though. Other factors, such as maintaining a healthy diet, keeping up a good level of exercise, and just living an otherwise active and healthy cognitive lifestyle, all of these are also associated with increased cognitive reserve. Finally, I'll add my own research into this picture, including my PhD and work carried out at the University of Reading also at my current home at the Aqua Aurora Center at UiT, the Arctic University of Norway. While we know that bilingualism contributes to cognitive and neural reserves in older age and thus delays the onset of dementia symptoms, the exact mechanisms of how this happens on a neural level is less known. Thinking about the nature of dementia symptoms, it becomes apparent that they are related to the decline of memory function. And a key brain structure involved in encoding memories is the hippocampus, which is a brain structure situated deep in the medial temporal lobe, right on either side of the brain. The hippocampus has been shown to be more susceptible to faster decline than other surrounding brain structures, and it is also sensitive to bilingual language experiences. Therefore, the focus of my work was to understand if there are any effects of bilingualism on this important brain structure. Now, during my PhD, I collected brain and behavioral data from monolingual and bilingual individuals living in the southeast England, most of them from the Greater Reading area. I posted adverts online, mostly on social media, describing the study and what it involved, and then people who were interested to visit us at the University of Reading contacted us and came in for testing. Then the participants spent a total of 3 to 4 hours sharing their language background with me, doing a variety of cognitive tasks, tapping into their executive control and also memory performance. And they also took part in an MRI scanning session, which involved going inside an MRI scanner for about 45 minutes, allowing me to collect a variety of brain scans. Now, after examining and analyzing their brain scans and performance and memory tasks, it emerged that the hippocampus was significantly larger for those who spoke more than one language. At the same time, memory performance was not significantly different between monolingual and bilingual individuals. So while there was additional neural matter in the hippocampus, it did not translate to a higher performance in the relevant cognitive abilities. Now, we can speculate that this might indicate some protection from bilingualism against neurodecline even in healthy aging, and this nicely adds to the literature supporting evidence for bilingualism-related neural reserve in these populations. Now, as a follow-up to this study, we collaborated with colleagues in Spain. There, they had collected brain data from individuals with a diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment. Their data came from hospitals in Barcelona, which is a region where 2 languages are spoken, Catalan and Spanish. As a result, all participants in the study were bilingual, but some of them actively spoke both languages in their everyday life, but while others had a passive understanding of both, but they really only used Spanish to communicate. Now, critically, what this allowed us was to compare different profiles of bilingualism, namely active and passive bilingualism. And the results from this study revealed that even within the bilingual populations, active bilingualism predicted later onset of MCI symptoms than passive bilingualism. Active bilingualism was also associated with increased hippocampal volume when compared to passive bilinguals. So it is clear that it is not only the presence or absence of bilingualism that matters, but also how actively both languages are engaged with and used. Another study we carried out looked at the metabolism in the brain. We used a method called magnetic resonance spectroscopy, or MRS. And this allowed us to pinpoint an area in the brain that is implicated in bilingualism and language control and measure metabolite levels in the structure. And specifically, we looked at the levels of different brain metabolites across all ages in monolingual and bilingual individuals. And what the results revealed was that bilingual experiences are reflected in changes at the level of metabolism in the brain, which may be responsible for driving the structural changes seen on the greater scale in the literature. And finally, I also did a literature review combining research studies in aging, neurodegeneration, and bilingualism. And looking at the studies I've mentioned and others in the wider field, one core thing that emerges is that while bilingualism, neurocognition, and aging research is still in its relatively early days, there really are good reasons to believe that bilingualism can contribute to improved outcomes not only in Alzheimer's dementia, but in a more general sense, be a neuroprotective factor, meaning that it might stave off or alleviate some symptom development in other types of neurodegeneration, like Parkinson's disease, for example, but also neurodegeneration not directly associated with aging, such as Huntington's disease or multiple sclerosis. And well, this at least would be my prediction, and it remains for future research to test this idea further. But this also nicely sets up my research program for the future. Now, great, you might be asking, but why should all of this matter? What is the real-world scientific contribution of this knowledge? What is the big picture take-home message? And the answer to that lies in the demographic structure of the world we all live in. Now, did you know that in 2019, the average age globally surpassed 30 for the first time in human history? And there are now twice as many people aged 60 and above than there were in 1980. So that's only 40 years ago. The number of 60-plus-year-olds is expected to break 2 billion by 2050. Now, with this in mind, the evidence that bilingualism contributes to cognitive and brain reserves in older people and may delay the onset of dementia symptoms, now this carries important public health implications. If anything, establishing bilingualism as a factor that does significantly contribute to public health in the later years of life, this might encourage policymakers to promote bilingualism where it already exists, encourage heritage bilingualism, and support minority bilingual communities. And maybe even revive bilingualism where it has been before, but does not exist anymore, by placing greater emphasis on language learning across the lifespan. So to sum up, can we say that bilinguals are better in any way than monolinguals? Absolutely not. However, we can say that bilingualism and the mental exercise involved in the management of more than one language in the brain does leave a mark in terms of improved executive control and also structural changes in the brain. This might become even more important in the older age, where the potential clinical effects of bilingualism are what makes this line of research extremely important, especially given an aging global population. However, we must interpret results with caution. Each individual study provides a building block, a small piece of puzzle which helps uncover the big picture and take us a step closer to scientific consensus. Therefore, sensationalism should be avoided. And I cannot leave you today with a loud statement that bilingualism is the key to solving all of the world's problems. I cannot say that bilinguals are better in any way than monolinguals, because it's just not the case. And when you see loud headlines in the media, it is usually just a misinterpretation of results reported in the scientific literature. Now let us revisit the media headlines we saw in the beginning. Are bilinguals smarter? Not at all. Are bilinguals more creative? Well, this is a complex question that needs some more looking into. And are bilinguals better lovers? Well, I don't even know how to begin testing this. It's just a very subjective thing, right? Now, on a more serious note, we still need to work towards understanding the mechanisms of bilingualism and how it contributes to improved health outcomes in aging populations in particular. However, it is very apparent that learning and using other languages is not detrimental in any way. It is fun, it opens up career opportunities, it improves cultural awareness, it makes it easier to communicate abroad, it may also be the source of improved neurocognitive outcomes across the lifespan, but especially in the older age. And I would also like to point out that carrying out research is not a one-man job. I have to thank the University of Reading, Center for Integrated Neuroscience and Neurodynamics, and Center for Literacy and Multilingualism for the infrastructure and other support that allowed me to carry this research. I would like to thank all of my participants, and if any of you are watching this, I truly appreciate you traveling and spending half a day with me doing all the tasks I presented you with. And finally, this would not be possible without the support and guidance from my colleagues and advisors, Christos Pliatzikis, Holly Robson, and Jason Rothman. Thank you.